Dear friends, dear colleagues, dear guests, dear experts. In the name of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, North Africa, I want to welcome you to this conference, The Quest for Monetary Sovereignty in the 21st Century in Africa. I am very happy to welcome so many experts from different parts of the world, which will discuss questions which sound very technical, but they are in reality in the heart of questions of self-determination, democracy, and the prospect of a decent life of African people. My name is, as Maha has said, Ivesa Lubben. I'm the head of office of the Tunis office. Maybe just to explain some words about the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. The Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is a left German foundation which is linked to the left party of Germany. We choose as a foundation the name of Rosa Luxemburg in remembering of the international militant peace activist Rosa Luxemburg, who was born as a Polish in Russia and then became a German and put always her international commitments above any kind of national interest. When we go back into history, we can see that in the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, the African continent was separated by the main colonial powers, who declared Africa their property and divided it among themselves. The continent was robbed from its resources and served as market for European products. All its economies, the production structure, infrastructure, educational systems and knowledge systems, even the culture was formed by colonial needs. African states became independent in the 1915s and the 1916s. But they inherited structures, economic structures, financial structures that reproduced dependencies. Even in spite of the independence, we heard yesterday during the book presentation of Dongo and Fanny, a lot of examples that when African states tried to overcome these kind of structures, even the former colonial powers used military means, political means, even political murders in order to prevent that African states break out of these structures. An important instrument in reproducing neo-colonial dependencies are financial and monetary relationships. Some of these examples are the dependencies of local currencies from currencies of former colonial powers. The African CFA franc, it's one of the most important examples, but other currencies also are indirectly dependencies from the main international currencies. Another example are the chronic debts, which are served by credits, which led to increased indebtedness. In some cases, like Tunisia, in which we held this conference, or Egypt, the foreign debts even were the pretext at the beginning of from the beginning of the 19th century to colonial occupation. It was perpetuated through colonial times and continued after independence. A third example is the steady intervention of international financial institutions and the conditionality of the International Monetary Fund, which didn't contribute to development, but in the contrary led to growing social discrepancies. As I told, we as Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, we see ourselves in the tradition and in the inheritance of Rosa Luxemburg. More than 100 years ago, Rosa Luxemburg published her major work, The Accumulation of Capital. In her book, which is one of the most important classics of Marxist economic thought, Luxemburg tries to prove that capitalist systems, in order to function, must continuously subordinate new geographic areas as markets and resources of capital accumulation. Thus, she concluded that colonization of the world is a sine qua non for the functioning of metropolitan capital. The regional limits of capital expansions were already reached in the first half of the last century by global colonization. In the 1950s and 60s, most countries achieved independence. Does it mean that the theories of Rosa Luxemburg today are not anymore valuable? That they became obsolete? I don't think so if we try to read Rosa Luxemburg in a creative way. Global capitalism penetrates more and more all spheres of life in a way and to an extent never witnessed in human history before. By means of commodification of all spheres of human life, the privatization of education and health, the commodification of housework, of recreation, and even of personal relationship. By the commodification of common goods like water, land access, and public spaces. By the transformation of all forms of knowledge into private property titles. By the submission of nature to the logic of profit maximization. And by a global financialization of economy that gives the financial sphere priority over the production and of commodities and by thus of the real world. This new stage of colonization of all forms and spheres of human existence threatens today the mere existence of the human itself. In the center of the work of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is the demand for social justice. Like in the last report of Oxfam, 26 billionaires in the world possess as much as half of the poorest part of the population worldwide. This social injustice today refers to countries between the North and the South. We have the growing social injustice within economic blocs, even within the European Union that Germany is part of, and within countries itself. As Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, we think that the most important task is to overcome these social injustices, be it between countries or be it within countries between social classes and stratas. We demand a social order that guarantees economic sustainability, climate justice, and sovereignty in all its forms, like monetary sovereignty, food sovereignty, political sovereignty, and economic sovereignty, as we see that all of them are linked to each other. If we ask for sovereignty for the peoples, we don't want a kind of form of withdrawal into forms of nationalism, as it happens as a kind of response to some of the challenges worldwide, and as rightist movements in Europe and also in the States propagate. But we think a sovereignty that is combined with cooperation between people and with communities in a solidarity way. Leftist movements, leftist organizations had always had ideas about their utopia. But often we lack ready-made recipes how to change the hegemonic economic order. Often our knowledge itself is the product of this hegemonic order, and especially when it comes to complicated matters as international finance or trade relationship. For this reason, we think that we need a debate that puts into question our way of thinking, the methodologies, the categories that we reflect in. It is often the way we used to think that prevents us from overcoming the system that actually we want to change. In the last couple of years, there came up new creative theoretical ideas about alternative to the international global economic order. We have, for example, the degrowth debate, or especially in Latin America under the title of Buen Vivir, to live good, who puts into question the paradigm of growth itself, be it in rightist or neoliberal theories, or be it even in Marxist theories. We have debates on alternative industrial policies in Europe among the left. In the US, we have the debates on the modern monetary theory that tries to combine monetary policies with sustainability and social justice. The modern monetary theory got new prominence with the debates about a new Green Deal, which is propagated by socialist trend within the Democratic Party in the States. We are very proud that we have some of the well-known representatives of this theory among us, as Fadhel Kaboub, who will have the lecture after me. With this conference, we want to make these debates known to an African public. We want to ask critically if they could contribute to overcome the neocolonial monetary structures that African economies are suffering from. We also want to make the African perspective known to the representatives of MMT and other progressive thinkers in Europe and in the global north in order to overcome the implicit Eurocentrism, which implies also in this case the US. And thirdly, we want to popularize alternative ways of thinking to make these ideas feasible for social movements that fight for more social and climate justice and international solidarity. At the very end of my talk, I want to thank everybody who had prepared this conference. My thanks go first of all to the coordination committee that consists of my colleagues Maha Ben Gadha, Ines Mahmoud, my Senegalese colleague Ndongo Samba Silla, Professor Fadhel Kaboub, who is from Tunis, but actually director of the Institute for Sustainable Prosperity in Ohio, and Professor Kai Koddenbrook from Germany, from the University of Witten-Herdecke. Thanks also to all the participants and experts who came to participate in this event, and thanks also to the organizational team, which often stays unnamed, to the translators and to my colleagues Rima Zina, Nargis Toshani and Sama Ayeshi, who had prepared administratively and all the logistics that make this debate possible. Thank you very much.
Merci. Merci, Ivesa. Sans trop tarder, parce que nous avons un programme assez chargé durant cette journée, j'invite Monsieur Fadhel Kaboub pour son intervention. Permettez-moi de vous présenter. Fadhel Kaboub est le président du Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Il est professeur agrégé d'économie à l'université de Denison. Ses recherches portent sur l'économie politique du Moyen-Orient et sur les dimensions fiscales et monétaires des programmes de création d'emplois. Il est l'auteur de nombreuses publications et ses travaux récents ont été présentés dans de nombreuses institutions prestigieuses, dont la Harvard Kennedy School of Government, la Harvard Law School, la Cornell University, la Columbia University, la Sorbonne et the National University of Singapore. Certains de ses récents commentaires sur l'emploi, le développement, la finance et les économies du Moyen-Orient ont été publiés dans le Financial Times, Al-Ahram Weekly, Radio France Internationale, National Radio, Public Radio, New Inquiry, BBC, Mundo, and others.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'll get started while we set up the PowerPoint. I want to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for hosting us here in Tunis today. I want to thank the organizing committee and a small army of people working behind the scenes, including the translators and the staff at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. This event has been at least 2 years in the making in terms of thinking about the purpose and the focus of this conference on economic and monetary sovereignty. We're here to think the theme, the quest for economic and monetary sovereignty. The implied concept here is that for most developing countries, post-colonial nations, we have political sovereignty. You rule over your territory, you have your president and prime minister and military and flag and everything, but never really achieved economic sovereignty and specifically monetary sovereignty. So this is really the underlying theme here, is that you can't really have political sovereignty and economic sovereignty without monetary sovereignty. And that's what led us to inviting a group of keynote speakers in different fields, not just in economics, but also participants from all over the continent and the rest of the world to be with us this week. I know the top of the thing is cut off, but I'm going to go ahead and get started just in case this is going to take a little bit longer. I'll just read the title just so you know what's on top. It's Reclaiming Monetary Sovereignty and Sustainable Prosperity. Oh, there is a display setting here. No, I'll just go like this and read it. The good news is that once we fix this, everybody else for the rest of the conference will have their slides working fine. Okay, so I want to start with a very basic definition of monetary sovereignty. So the line that's missing on top is, what is monetary sovereignty? And a monetarily sovereign government is a government that can issue its own currency, which any country can do, issue their own currency. In Tunis, we issue the Tunisian dinar. It's a government that collects taxes denominated in the national currency. Same thing in Tunisia, for example, we collect taxes in Tunisian dinar and only in Tunisian dinar. So the first and second bullet points are pretty straightforward. Any government can do this. It's the third and fourth where we start seeing countries losing monetary sovereignty. So number 3, it's a government that only issues debt denominated in the national currency. In other words, you only issue government bonds that are denominated in the national currency. In Tunisia, for example, we issue government bonds denominated in Tunisian dinars, but we also issue government bonds denominated in dollars and euros and Japanese yen and other currencies. And that's the part where a country starts to lose its monetary sovereignty, because now you have an external debt denominated in a foreign currency that you don't have. And I'll emphasize this point later. And then fourth, it's a country that doesn't fix its exchange rate to the dollar or euro or any foreign currency, or to gold. So having a flexible exchange rate gives you full monetary sovereignty. And that's not an easy thing to achieve for developing countries that have a lot of external debt and are dependent on food imports and energy imports and other basic necessities like medical equipment and things like that. So it's number 3 and 4 that should be the focus of our attention in the next couple of days, because this is the structural issue that forces countries into a situation where they lose their monetary sovereignty. And this distinction, this basic definition, allows us to focus on the difference between a currency issuer, which is the national sovereign government, and the rest of us, users of the currency. Households, firms, any other entity outside of the government. And this approach is really the central focus of MMT, or modern monetary theory, which is the approach that's kind of behind this analysis. So once we understand the definition of monetary sovereignty, we realize that not all countries are equally sovereign when it comes to monetary sovereignty. So I'd like you to think of a spectrum of monetary sovereignty, where on one side of the spectrum, you have countries who have full monetary sovereignty. They issue their currency, they tax in the same currency, they have a national debt only denominated in their currency, and they don't fix their exchange rate. So the good examples would be the case of the United States, the case of Japan, the case of Canada, Australia, the UK, and so on. These are countries that enjoy full monetary sovereignty. The other extreme end of the spectrum are countries who completely lost or giving up their monetary sovereignty. The case of Ecuador, for example, where a country completely dollarized and stopped using a national currency. The case of the CFA countries, who essentially use a foreign currency since colonial times to this day. But most developing countries are somewhere in between on the spectrum. And the position of the country on that spectrum will depend on the level of external debt that the country has relative to its economy. It depends on, how desperately the country needs to fix its exchange rate or manage its exchange rate close to a particular margin. And I'll emphasize this point. So our focus will be on countries that have weaker levels of monetary sovereignty in the next few days in this conference. And I'll use Tunisia as an example today, just because I grew up in this country and I know a lot about it. So the key implications for monetary sovereignty are the following. So what I want to talk about here is for countries that have full monetary sovereignty, and the goal, as I will explain in a minute, is we want to reach this level of full monetary sovereignty and full independence. But the key implications that, number one, government budget is not the same thing as a household budget. This is something that the economics profession has created so much damage in, popularizing this idea that, individual household finances should translate the same logic and the same even moral principles to the national government budget. So one thing MMT makes very clear is that households have to follow sound financial principles. So you and I have to work, earn an income, then spend it. We can spend beyond our income if we borrow. But once we borrow, we have a serious financial burden that we have to pay off at some point, which means you have to either reduce your spending at some point in the future or increase your income somehow in the future. But it becomes a real financial stressor on a family's budget. The government, on the other hand, the government is the only legal sovereign issuer of the currency. So the logic of government spending is that the government spends money into existence first so that the rest of us in the economy can have access to it. So spending comes first, then taxing comes from the money that's already in circulation. So the logic is very different, which means a deficit for the government is not the same thing as a deficit for a household budget. A deficit for the government means that the government put more money into the economy than what it's taking out. And we'll talk about the implications of this in a minute, which means that government spending is not constrained by tax revenues, because as a matter of logic, government spending comes before tax revenues or tax receipts. Government deficit is essentially the exact equivalent to the surplus accumulated by the non-government sector. So whatever the government puts into the economy that it doesn't take out in terms of taxes, that's money remaining in circulation in the private sector, in the non-government sector. So this is an extremely important concept for us to realize, that when the government tries to balance its budget and follows austerity policies and even tries to run a surplus, the equivalent of that would be a destruction of net financial assets from the private sector. And that's a very important distinction in the MMT framework. So spending for the government is not constrained by tax revenues, but it doesn't mean it's unlimited. So nobody in the MMT framework says that the government can just spend unlimited amounts of money. So what is the real limit from an MMT perspective on government spending? It's the inflationary potential. So we have to always have the government spend with an eye towards the potential risk of inflation. And the risk of inflation is determined by the productive capacity in the economy. It's determined also by market power for some key players who happen to be price setters. And in the case of developing countries, in many cases, market power and corruption overlap quite a bit. So these are the three things that you want to pay attention to when you're spending. What is the inflationary potential of additional government spending? I'll give you a quick example. Today in the Tunisian economy, in any developing economy, you can spend the equivalent of, say, $100 million, and it will have an inflationary repercussion. But you can also spend the same $100 million in the same economy in a different sector of the economy without having any inflationary implication. A good example would be spending $100 million today to install solar panels in Tunisia. You're paying workers and technicians $100 million in total for their wages, for their work. What are they going to do with $100 million? There's going to be an increase in food consumption, there's going to be an increase in transportation, an increase in spending on entertainment, on whatever people want to spend their money on. So you look at all these industries that will experience an increase in demand. And if you realize one of those industries has a shortage of productive capacity, that's where you're going to see inflation. But you can spend the same $100 million on employing a smaller number of people in the solar industry, and then dedicate some of the rest of the spending to increasing productive capacity in the food production area, for example, or the transportation production area, so that you're increasing demand, but at the same time you're also increasing productive capacity in anticipation of more demand in those areas. So MMT is very clear about not all spending is equally inflationary. So always spend with an eye towards the risk of inflation and target the spending in that area so that you're increasing productive capacity. And then use taxation and regulation not to fund government programs, but use taxation to reduce market power, use regulation to reduce corruption, to reduce market power, to target the price setters in key industries. So that's a very different perspective than the usual mainstream economics perspective that assumes by definition that any government spending is going to be equally inflationary. So what can a monetary sovereign government do with full monetary sovereignty? Number one is decoupling the spending from the taxing. In other words, unlike a regular household where we usually think of earning an income first so that we can pay for our expenditure, the government can completely separate the taxing and the spending functions. Both are important, but they're not necessarily linked in the way we usually think of them. So spend on national priorities. If national priorities are health or infrastructure or education or renewable energy, set the national priorities and spend accordingly. And then tax pollution, not because we need money from polluters to fund health programs. Tax speculation in financial markets, not because we need money from banks to fund education. Tax extreme wealth, not because we need money or permission from the wealthy to fund national priorities, but tax in order to reduce pollution, in order to reduce speculation, in order to reduce extreme inequality, in order to reduce the power and influence of the oligarchs in the political system, to protect democracy from oligarchy. So these are important functions for taxation, but they're not necessarily for the purpose of funding a particular national program. So decoupling the two functions is an important strategic thing for any democracy. So tax to reduce excessive wealth, abusive market power, regulate markets so that we can pre-distribute wealth. Because we usually think of taxation as a form of redistribution. So we have this engine in the economy that produces pollution, produces inequality, produces socioeconomic exclusion, and we allow it to function this way, and we even try to accelerate it so that we have more economic growth. And then we say, oh, it's producing a lot of inequality, so let's tax the wealthy and redistribute to the working class and the middle class. The MMT perspective is saying, change the engine from the beginning. So regulate the system to produce the pre-distribution effect that you want to have as an outcome, as opposed to having a malfunctioning system and then saying at the end, oh, let's redistribute to compensate the losers from the system. So it's a very different strategy that we would like to achieve with full monetary sovereignty. So regulate markets to regulate and reduce excessive market power, price-setting behavior, and corruption, which will be extremely important in our case. And this is the part that I wanted to see. These are, and this didn't work the way I wanted it to work because of the PowerPoint problem. So I'm going to move this to the side, and it's not moving. Help. This was supposed to be funny, but it didn't work. Technology is not cooperating. Can I delete the hashtag goals? Just remove the hashtag goals. Okay. It was supposed to be line by line, but it didn't function in this way. No. Is this from the Google Drive?
Let me PowerPoint. Just to view.
Oh, view only.
Oh, view only.
Yeah, if you can. Yeah. Okay. Oh, it's actually
Yeah,
it's actually fine. So those are.
sur Google
Okay. Oh, no, c'est bon. Okay, it's working now for some reason. Okay, so these are the goals once we achieve full monetary sovereignty. And what I want to talk about next is that we don't have full monetary sovereignty. And what we want to do is zoom in on the root causes of the things that actually cause developing countries to lose monetary sovereignty or never have achieved monetary sovereignty since independence. So a brief recap of economic development, and this is, a vast, over simplification of the history, but I think many of you from different parts of the world and experts in economic development will agree that the main trends are there. So post-colonial states usually engaged in state-led economic development in the 1950s and 60s. This kind of the Keynesian era was kind of still alive and well. Import substitution industrialization was a key strategy that most developing countries, Tunisia in particular, used in the 50s and 60s. Import substitution is the idea that, under a protectionist system back in the day, you could, develop infant industries and drive the economic development process with industrialization that replaces what used to be imports and produce them locally under a protectionist and subsidized system. That system didn't last very long, and it didn't necessarily work very well for most countries. That was followed in the 70s by export-led growth. In Tunisia in 1972, the government passed a law to open up the economy to the global system and to drive economic growth with exports. And I'll show you some of the data later. This was followed by the debt crisis of the 1980s, mid-1980s. Tunisia experienced, food riots related to the debt crisis in the 1985, 86. And this was a global phenomenon. It wasn't just Tunisia. Obviously, many developing countries ended up in that cycle. So what I want to emphasize here is, why did the import substitution industrialization not work for Tunisia and for, most developing countries, but it worked for, the Asian tigers, for example? Why did export-led growth not work for us, even though we still believe that this is the only way out? But it worked for some other countries. And this is kind of the focus of what I look at. And after the debt crisis, we were forced into a corner with the World Bank, with the IMF, to follow structural adjustment policies, the SAPs, the neoliberal reforms that we still live with to this day. So this is the trade balance for Tunisia, looking at this falling off the cliff in 1973, 74, right after Tunisia decided to go into export-led growth. So export-led growth was supposed to generate the foreign currency reserves to drive economic prosperity in Tunisia. And this picture is not unusual. We look at most developing countries. As soon as they open up to export-led growth, we go into a massive decline in the trade balance. And the flip side of this picture is the external debt. As soon as you start accelerating economic growth via exports, you start accumulating massive amounts of external debt. Right? So what's going on here? Why is it that the faster we try to export, the more external debt we end up accumulating? Well, because the industrialization process never really fully achieved its potential. Because you ended up in a system where you specialize in low value added manufacturing, which means you have to import all the intermediate goods. You have to import all the capital equipment. In other words, you import high value added content and you export low value added content. So the idea of specializing in trade worked exactly in the opposite direction for developing countries because they specialized in low value added manufacturing, cheap assembly line. In addition to that, most developing countries, especially countries that don't have a lot of energy resources, the faster you industrialize, the more electricity you have to produce, the more shipping and transportation you have to spend money on, which means you end up importing more oil, more fossil fuels to drive the economic development process. So you end up with more imports of intermediate goods, more imports of technology, more imports of energy, but you're exporting low value-added content. So the faster you accelerate exports, the deeper the problem gets. And this is not a thing of the past. We're still living in this structure. So this is extremely important to identify the mechanics of the existing system. And if the mechanics is working in the wrong direction, there's a famous line from Einstein where he says, the very definition of insanity is when you keep doing this, the exact same thing over and over and over again and hoping for a different outcome. And this is insanity. So the mainstream model to address these weaknesses, you're familiar with this list: austerity, debt restructuring is the only way to manage external debt. Privatization of state-owned enterprises, sell the electric company, sell the airports, sell the airlines. It brings a little bit of money, you spend it in 2 or 3 years, and then you're back to square one. You can't privatize the telecom every 5 years. Once you privatize it, it's gone. Right? So these are short-term Band-Aid solutions. Labor market flexibility, race to the bottom, deregulate the labor market to attract foreign investors looking for cheaper labor. Not realizing that foreign direct investment is not necessarily only looking for cheap labor. I mean, why do companies relocate from the United States and go to Canada? Not for their cheap labor or environmental deregulation. But the kind of labor we ended up specializing in is the kind that forces you to race to the bottom, right, as opposed to race to the top. Foreign direct investment, export-led growth, we talked about this a minute ago. It's the negative terms of trade, the idea that you specialize in low value added, so it's a constant trap. Financial liberalization. You end up artificially creating a financial structure that attracts speculators exclusively because you're deregulating financial markets, you're lowering taxes, you're artificially creating higher financial returns via central bank policy, and you ended up attracting investors who are interested in buying low and selling high as soon as possible. So you end up with hot money coming into the economy very quickly. The economy, the financial system will thrive for a little bit, and as soon as the returns are high enough for speculators to leave, they'll sell and leave, which means you have a stock market crash, you have a banking crisis, and you have a currency crisis because they're taking money out, and you've offered them no capital controls to attract them in the first place. So not a sustainable strategy for developing countries to attract the best speculators of the world. Tourism, and this is very important for us here in Tunisia, for developing countries. It's often viewed as the only thing that will allow the economy to thrive because you're bringing millions of tourists, they bring euros and dollars, and the central bank is obsessed with those euros and dollars because they need to pay the debt. The problem with tourism is that it looks like a solution, but it has a big problem hidden in it. Because when you're bringing millions of tourists, you have to feed them, so you end up importing a lot of food when you don't have food sovereignty. When you bring a lot of tourists, you have to transport them, you have to heat and cool the buildings for them and the swimming pools, so you end up importing more fossil fuels, more energy for transportation and heating and cooling and shipping and so on. So the more tourism you have, the more imports you have. So you end up with the bigger problem in the trade balance. So we accelerate tourism, we accelerate exports, we accelerate the trade imbalance. And as a result, you accelerate the pressure on the exchange rate, you accelerate the external debt. So not a sustainable solution economically, but also environmentally. When you have water shortages, when you have lack of food sovereignty, this is not a sustainable solution. Remittances, export, all of your engineers and doctors to Europe and the rest of the world, and they'll send money back home. Not a sustainable solution. When you need human capital for economic development, it's not a good strategy to try to export all of your skilled labor and specialize even more in unskilled labor type of industries. And this is something that, unfortunately, government after government finds so attractive, this idea. Like even in Tunisia, during the presidential debate, the question came up, what will be your strategy to negotiate with the European Union? And one of the candidates on the stage, one of the 25 or 26 candidates, came up with a brilliant idea and said, this thing we have with Europe, they take all of our skilled labor. And I said, oh, this is interesting. He's really bringing something important here. And then he said, we need to be really tough in the negotiations and tell them for every skilled worker you take, we'll give you 5 unskilled. So we're not even close to addressing the brain drain. His solution is send more, right? Because that's the only way to solve the problem. So it's a race to the bottom, unfortunately. It's more external debt. And as I said, it's the very definition of insanity to do all of these things repeatedly, regardless of the orientation of the administration. Left-wing, right-wing, Islamists, they all have the same solution. And then you end up with the same debt crisis. And you're told there's no alternative, right? And the IMF comes in and says, well, this time do it a little harder, a little better. Maybe it will work, right? And, it's a trap. This time it worked. So, the structural issues that we're dealing with, high external debt related to trade deficits, the major root causes for most developing countries are 3 areas. Number 1 is energy deficits, importing fossil fuels. And this is actually true even for countries that are net exporters of oil, crude oil, because they too export crude oil, which is low value added content, and they import refined petrochemicals, or they import gasoline and kerosene, which is higher value added content. So the refining capacity is not even there. So even if you're oil rich, you're still trapped in this low value added content system. So you have energy deficits, food deficits, and then the deeper structural issue, which is across the board, low value added content of export because of the kind of industrialization that we ended up pursuing. So these trade deficits lead to currency devaluations. And if your currency becomes weaker, like we've experienced in Tunisia and Egypt and many parts of the world, a weaker currency means the next morning when you're trying to import wheat, when you're trying to import gasoline, when you're trying to import medicine, all of those imports will be relatively more expensive in real terms, which means you're going to have food riots on the streets because people can't afford these more expensive products, which means the government has to step in and artificially subsidize those items or engage in more external debt to continue to finance this structure. And this is not a one-year episode. This is a constant every year episode for the last several decades. And again, repeating the same thing over and over, hoping for a better outcome, is insanity. And what we're trying to argue in the next couple of days is we need to look for alternative solutions, and alternative solutions that are not Band-Aid solutions that just, address the symptoms of the problem, but we need to look at the structures of the problem. And if the roots of the problem are energy sovereignty, food sovereignty, low value added content type of industrialization, then our alternative policies have to target those areas. So the only way out is investment in renewable energy to reclaim or gain energy sovereignty, sustainable agriculture, to regain food sovereignty, water and energy management conservation policy. So it's not just producing more, but being more effective and more efficient at using it. This obsession with free trade that we've been, brainwashed with for the last several decades is not necessarily the best way to pursue economic development. So looking at different models of trade. In here I have South-South trade policy. In other words, trade, we're told, is good because it enhances competition. And we're told that competition is good because it improves competitiveness, it improves customer service, it lowers prices, it brings new technologies. So it's sold as a good thing for consumers, it's a good thing for the economy. And there's this whole idea that competition is always good. But competition amongst equal is good. Even in sports, if you watch a boxing game, we have heavyweight champions fighting heavyweight champions, and that's competition. And it's legal and fair, and people enjoy it as a form of entertainment. But even in sports, we don't allow a heavyweight boxing champion to play a lightweight boxing champion. We say this is competition. It's illegal. It's unethical. It's ugly. Nobody would watch it. And yet, when it comes to trade, we allow that to happen. We take heavyweight countries, industrialized countries, and have them essentially destroy the competition in smaller developing economies. And we say that it's fair, it's competition, it's trade, it's healthy for you, right? So we're talking about competition amongst equal, and one way to do this is to form regional trading areas with equally competitive, but especially complementary economies, complementary in terms of capacities, in terms of resources, and that's one way to benefit from trade. And then absolutely necessary focus on value-added driven industrial policy. And one way to do this, and I've written about this, the idea of the job guarantee, where you focus on employment-led growth, so that the spending and the job creation that you're putting in place is targeting those structural areas, and have a true industrial policy, a true agricultural policy, a true renewable energy policy that allow you to build from within, mobilize domestic resources as much as possible. We're not saying close your economy to international trade. We're not saying end tourism. We're not saying, end your openness to the rest of the world, but be more selective, be more strategic, and focus on the structural weaknesses. It's not going to be easy economically. It's not going to be easy geopolitically. But if you don't have the vision for an alternative model, then we've lost already from day one. The first step is to have an alternative vision and pursue those goals, and then leverage your resources as much as possible to achieve those goals. What about inflation? This is a huge concern for developing countries, and I think the MMT perspective gives us a better lens for understanding the inflationary pressure that most developing countries struggle with. When you have a food deficit, when you have energy deficits, you're importing inflation, because the depreciation of your exchange rate from the trade imbalance is what forces you into higher energy prices and higher food prices. Low value-added industrialization is part of the problem, because that's the component that also drives down the value of your currency. So everything you import, you're importing it at an international price, and you have no control over that pricing mechanism. So always spend with an eye towards the inflationary pressure. And if the inflationary pressure in your case is coming from housing, then you target inflation in that way, not the usual inflation targeting that central banks do. Central banks, what do? They raise interest rates, they lower interest rates. What does that have to do with housing? What does that have to do with healthcare? It's not targeted enough. So when we talk about true inflation targeting, the way I think about inflation targeting, it's not exclusively the job of the central bank. It's a job of the Ministry of Agriculture. It's a job of the Ministry of Energy. It's a job of the Ministry of Housing. It's all of these areas where you identify the pressure points, and that becomes your inflation policy. Is partly managed by the Ministry of Agriculture. It's partly managed by the Ministry of Education, right? To specialize in higher value-added content, you need investment in education, vocational training, technical skills. That has nothing to do with the central bank. The central bank can set interest rates all year long, and it will not change anything in the structure of the economy, right? So all of these artificial manipulations of central bank policy are extremely ineffective and weak ways of addressing inflation. But somehow we're told that's the only way to manage inflation, is give it to the central bankers, they know what to do, right? In terms of market power, it's the price setters who set prices. And central banks can raise interest rates, lower interest rates. If you're a powerful price setter, you're going to be a powerful price setter. And in cases of countries that rely on imports of basic necessities like food, energy, medical equipment, you typically have the government providing licenses for key importers that have exclusive power to be the only company or the only individual who is legally allowed to import gasoline, who is legally allowed to import bananas, who is legally allowed to import medicine. And once you have that market power licensed by the government, in many cases through corruption mechanisms, then if global prices go up or the currency depreciates, you raise prices, but then things calm down internationally, but you don't see any incentive to lower prices. So you take advantage of higher prices constantly. And that's that has to end. You can't have a corrupt price-setting mechanism taking advantage of people who want to buy bread just because they can. Right? So corruption, capital controls has to be part of the equation. You can't exit this trap without using the leverage of the government in the area of capital controls. So what I want to end with is 3 practical solutions, not the only solutions, but 3 practical solutions that I've been advocating for a while, and I'm hoping to inspire some of you to think outside the box and think about a different way to exit this trap. And the 3 examples that I present will focus on sustainable food production, sustainable housing, and cultural heritage preservation. So, aquaponics, which is not a new technology invented at MIT. It's an ancient technique, thousands of years old, of producing sustainable food, organic food, in the most water-efficient system. You're essentially saving 90% of water compared to traditional agriculture. And with climate change, with the kinds of droughts that we're experiencing all over the world, this has to be part of the equation. When you have a technique that's so accessible and so affordable and extremely efficient, not using it is also, I think, a definition of insanity. So what is aquaponics? Aquaponics farming is a very simple technique of growing edible fish in the same ecosystem as leafy greens, lettuce, tomatoes, anything, and I'll show you some examples. It's a very simple technology that many companies today are actually taking to a high-tech level, and I'll show you a few examples. But the simple technique is the following. The fish produces organic waste. The organic waste decomposes naturally with bacteria that develops in the system and produces fertilizers. So you use a pump that pumps the water into a grow bed, and the leafy greens will absorb all the nutrients or all the fertilizers, and then will return, with gravity, will return clean water to the fish. So you're recycling the water over and over again, and that's how you save 90% of water use. The additional advantage of this is that you don't have to use any fertile land to grow vegetables. Those leafy greens are grown into clay pebbles because you don't need any nutrients from the soil. All the nutrients are provided from the fish waste. So it's 100% organic. You can't put any pesticides or chemicals in it because you kill the bacteria, you kill the fish, you kill the whole thing. So you're producing 100% organic leafy greens, and you're producing protein. You're producing fish for human consumption. And you don't need any soil. So you can place this in the middle of the city. You can place this in the most rural areas with no fertile land and no access to sufficient quantities of water, which means you can decentralize food sovereignty in every region. And you can do it on a small scale for one household. You can do it on a village scale, on a neighborhood scale, and you can do it on a national scale. And this is really where some companies are really investing in scaling this up and turning it into a high-tech system where you use high-tech sensors to monitor the quality of the water, the temperature, the humidity, the level of nutrients. So the level of research and development involved in this is really taking us into the future. But you can also use it in a low-tech model where you do a small scale and you do what I tried to do when I started learning about this system. So the technology is there. It's accessible. It's within reach. But do we have the vision and a commitment to reclaim food sovereignty by using many of the indigenous techniques that we have all over the world that are more sustainable, more effective, economically, ecologically, on all levels, instead of the current, ag business model that we have. So this is I tried to experiment with this, and I'm not a farmer. I don't have any experience. I wanted to see how accessible this. So this is my fish tank, and you can use worms also to break down the waste. And you can grow lettuce, mint, anything that's leafy green. Within a few weeks, it grows out of control because it's extremely productive. I didn't expect that to grow through the roof. In the middle of the winter, you can produce organic tomatoes, and that's the tilapia fish, very edible. or on a larger scale. So this company is called Superior Fresh, LLC, in Wisconsin. This is the largest aquaponics farm that I know of. It just started a few years ago. Massive industrial scale, 100% organic, producing salmon and producing leafy greens of all kinds. So we can scale this up at the region. We don't have to start with 100% food sovereignty next month, but let's start experimenting on a smaller scale. Let's involve universities in research and development, because this is the kind of interdisciplinary work where you need an expert in biology, an expert in solar energy because you want to use solar pumps. There's plenty of potential for engineering and research and development to improve the quality of the agricultural product that you're bringing in. This is another company based in New York. They specialize in microgreens, which is higher value added, I guess, for fancy restaurants that like those things. There's plenty of these in Australia and Singapore and other parts of the world. And again, not a technology that was invented by Americans or by the British or by Western civilization. This is from the global South. And now it's a technology of the West. This is just one example. This example here, I'm sorry, the screen is cut off. This is in Tunisia. This is Hajj Blayoun in Qirwan, fi Tunis, in Tunisia. Sorry, I'm switching languages now. Sustainable housing. Low energy consumption housing with local materials and modernized to meet modern day requirements. These are just a small group of activists, housing sustainability activists who are really trying to rediscover our native architecture and bring it to the modern era. The advantage of using adobe houses or super adobe houses is that it requires very little amount of energy for heating and cooling because it uses geothermal ventilation. Again, not a technology invented by MIT. Geothermal technology existed for thousands of years and all over the world. We just were told to give it up because it's too native, and we're told to import air conditioners and bricks and cement because that's more modern, right? But there are groups now rediscovering these techniques and modernizing these techniques, and to produce the quality of life that everybody deserves. So there are solutions. We just don't have enough of a leadership and vision to scale these and bring these techniques from indigenous culture to the 21st century. We're not saying we have to go back to the caves and go back to farming, with low value added. And no, these are techniques that, to me, this is what development is. Development is not destroying the old and bringing, the new. It's taking what we already have, what we already know, and making it better, making it more effective and more efficient. And this is what some of these groups are doing. This is Tatooine, by the way, those of you who are visiting. Not Planet Tatooine from Star Wars. This is the actual Tatooine. This is not a movie. This is Tunisian civilization. So this is not new, not invented by architects in Chicago or whatever. So, just stopped here, I think. So imagine the possibilities of jobs to reclaim food sovereignty, jobs to reclaim energy sovereignty. This froze for some reason. Jobs to revive local cultural heritage. With every elderly person passing away, we lose part of our history, we lose part of our knowledge, part of our language. So think of jobs in kind of digitizing indigenous oral history and indigenous culture. Think of jobs to preserve languages. And many native indigenous communities are losing their language and losing their culture, and that's a loss to all humanity, not just to countries. Jobs focusing on regional ecotourism, and this is high value added tourism. So imagine developing sustainable housing of the kind that I showed, creating bed and breakfast structures of sustainable housing, low energy consumption, with aquaponics farming and aquaponics bed and breakfast restaurants, with sustainable architecture, building local cultural heritage museums, and all of a sudden you have an ecosystem, an economic ecosystem that attracts a different kind of tourist. A tourist who's not coming for the nightclubs and the beaches and the swimming pools, the low value added, unsustainable kind of tourism, but a tourist who's willing to pay a premium to eat healthier food, to discover local indigenous culture, to stay at a bed and breakfast that you know is sustainable ecologically, and to know that you're contributing to a different path towards economic development. Now imagine scaling this up and that becomes the norm of tourism as opposed to the current norm. So we're not saying end all tourism, but bring a different kind of tourism, a high value added, more sustainable kind of tourism. Research and development, as I said, in new indigenous knowledge and technologies to upgrade indigenous knowledge and bring it to the 21st century as opposed to destroy it and erase it and then replace it with imported technology where you end up constantly trapped in that system that I described. So these are just a few possibilities. And all of these things, because of the decentralized nature of everything that I described here, you're actually reactivating or activating participatory democracy in a most decentralized way. And you're also exiting from underneath the power structure of the oligarchy. In some cases, you're exiting from underneath the power structure of the price setters, of the key players who control the food market, who control imports, who control energy imports in particular. You're creating a new economic structure that's by definition more participatory, more democratic, more decentralized, and more sustainable economically, culturally, and ecologically. And with that, I'll stop here and I'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shukran.
Thank you.
Merci Fadhel. Merci de faire le lien justement entre les politiques monétaires, la souveraineté monétaire et comment se déplacer dans la sphère de l'économie réelle et comment how to achieve the economic sovereignty. S'il y a des questions dans la salle, je peux passer le micro directement aux gens qui sont intéressés pour poser des questions.
Merci.
If people can come closer to the front so that we don't waste time with passing
Sure.
the mics.
Elizabeth Cobbett from the University of East Anglia in the UK. Thank you, that was a brilliant talk, really, really
Thank you.
interesting. Just a question, so when I was traveling here, I went to Norwich Airport and I said, could I have some dinner Tunisian currency? They said, no, it's controlled. So I just would like you to explain a little bit how's it controlled, who's controlling it, and what's the goal of the control of the currency within Tunisia, please?
Maha, should we take multiple questions or answer them?
Okay. Maybe 3 questions?
3 questions and then we answer it once.
Yeah, hi, Jasmine from FTDS, Forum Tunisien des Droits Économiques et Sociaux. I'm just wondering, as we've seen, it comes down to political will in all these initiatives. How optimistic are you with respect to the feasibility of this change?
Thank you. Optimism comes and goes, but we'll talk about it. It's a cycle. Oh, sure. Is there another question?
Thank you very much. My name's Harry. I'm from Durham University. I wanted to ask about your criteria for monetary sovereignty at the beginning. I'm wondering if there's something additional there. So you mentioned flexible exchange rates, and of course the US and the UK used to have fixed exchange rates to gold, but I'm not sure if that meant they were less monetary sovereign, because they still had the possibility of leaving that fixed exchange rate when they did, and that showed that they had that possibility all along because they controlled their own economic space and financial institutions more globally. And similarly, if Tunisia decided tomorrow to have a flexible exchange rate and to only issue bonds in Tunisian dinar, I'm not sure that Tunisia would immediately become more monetary sovereign as a result. So are there more things going on there about power and other relationships?
Good. I'll start answering the questions in reverse order. I'll start with that question. So to be very clear, nobody in the MMT community is arguing that developing countries to switch to flexible exchange rate tomorrow so that they have more monetary sovereignty. As you've seen in the presentation, it's not a question of switching from fixed to flexible overnight. It's about the structural issues that are related to food sovereignty, energy sovereignty. So in order to have the opportunity to move to that full monetary sovereignty space, first you have to fix the structural issues. So once you get to a situation where you have more energy sovereignty, you have more food sovereignty, and you fix the industrial deficiencies that you have, that will get you in a situation where your trade imbalance is not a huge burden on your exchange rate in the first place. But if you switch today to flexible exchange rate without central bank intervention, then what you're going to have the next day is food riots on the streets, because everything you're importing with your flexible exchange rate is going to bring you imported inflation for food and medicine and energy. So we're definitely not advocating that, because this is usually the critique, from observers to MMT. They say, oh, you want flexible exchange rate? Look what happened to, Venezuela. Look what happened to countries when they're. We're not saying that. We're saying address the structural issues, and that will lead you to a path towards more flexible exchange rate. So your question about the US and the UK under the gold standard, having a fixed exchange rate to gold limits your fiscal policy space, because you're committed to fixing your currency at a particular rate. So moving away from a fixed exchange rate essentially increases the fiscal policy space that the US and the UK have today. Now, having that fiscal policy space, but with a vision of neoclassical perspective, sound finance perspective, doesn't mean you're using that fiscal policy space, because you're always thinking you don't have this space, because you're thinking any spending is going to be equally inflationary, and you worry about that. And that's why I try to stress in my presentation, spending with an eye towards inflation in particular industries is the way to actually maximize your fiscal policy space without causing inflation. But if you spend in the wrong area, and if you feed price setters, what are they going to do? They're going to feed on their power, right? So it's very important to focus on the structural issues as opposed to the definition of monetary sovereignty. The definition is, once you get there, you have those areas. It doesn't mean you switch to those areas and all of a sudden you enjoy sovereignty. It's doing the hard work to get to the monetary sovereignty space. Right? I hope I answered all your questions. The question about optimism and pessimism, I said it comes and goes. So after the revolution in Tunisia in 2010, 2011, I had a lot of hope. But that hope was immediately gone, because I realized that all the political voices on the scene had the same list when it comes to their economic solutions. I have a little bit more hope today because of the resetting of the political scene in Tunisia in particular, but I'm also nervous and anxious because I don't see an alternative vision for economic development. I'm worried that the same solutions of the same trap are going to be put in place, accelerated, done maybe with a little less corruption, but as they say, do it a little harder this time, it's not going to fix it. So I'm hopeful that there's an opening, especially with this event here, with so many people in different parts of the world here and watching us on live stream, thinking in a new way about the process of economic development and focusing on structural issues as opposed to these band-aid solutions. Because this is a huge risk to the democratic process when people give up hope on democracy and see that the economic inequality and unemployment and poverty outcomes are the same, and in some cases getting worse with the democratic process. That becomes very dangerous for the democratic process that we're trying to put in place. So there's an opportunity, but there's also a risk of not doing things differently and repeating the same mistakes and hoping for a better outcome. And then finally, your question about the Tunisian dinar. When a country has a fixed exchange rate, or at least a target range for a fixed exchange rate, if we allow all the Tunisian citizens to go on vacation every summer, well, it costs money to go to Europe, right? So you have to go to the airport at the currency exchange thing, sell 10,000 dinars and buy euros, right? Well, the central bank will freak out if everybody does that at once. So in Tunisia, we have limited quotas for each citizen in terms of how much you can exchange from the local currency to foreign currencies. Because if the central bank loses currency reserves, euros, dollars, British pounds, Japanese yen, then how are we going to pay for the trade deficit? How are we going to import medicine? How do we import? So if you allow for more external flow of foreign currency reserves from Tunisia, then you're putting more downward pressure on the exchange rate, which means the next morning when we're importing wheat or medicine, it's going to come at a much higher real cost, and you're going to have food riots on the streets. So that management of the exchange rate is just the symptom of the problem. And what I try to emphasize today is the structural issues, the root causes of the problem, which is food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and the defective industrialization process that most developing countries, Tunisia included, have pursued. So to get to a point where you can go to any airport in the world and exchange Tunisian dinars for any currency you want, we'll have to fix the roots of the problem first. But you can have the central bank tomorrow saying, if you want to travel, buy Tunisian currency in any airport, any part of the world, go for it. Then we'll suffer the consequences that I was describing. But that's part of the lack of vision on the political scene, is that they focus on the exchange rate as a binary. It's either fixed or flexible. And there's almost no discussion about what is the process that leads you towards a more comfortable, flexible exchange rate policy. But right now, it's extremely dangerous to go there. You literally have food riots within weeks, right? If we allow, complete liberalization of the currency. And it's not just Tunisia; it's most developing countries. Just questions.
My name is Chibui Kuche, Leiden University. Thank you for your lecture. I'm more interested in the solution, your practical solutions. And one of the professors in my university estimates that by the year 2100, Africa will have about 4 billion people from the present 1.3 billion. And that we also know that most of the countries in the world with food security problems are in Africa. In your view, do you think that this is an important elephant in the room that has to be addressed before? And of course, I like your fish tank theory. What my worry is your high-tech theory. Do you think, what can we do as a continent to ensure that in future we won't also end up in this export-led kind of industrialization concept where we import expensive technologies, sensor technologies, and then export very basic food stuff? Thank you.
Right. There's a question there.
شكرا محمد رضا البقلوتي. نعم، إعلامي مدير النشرة الإلكترونية لحظة بلحظة. طبعا سألقي السؤال بالعربية.
تفضل.
هي طبعا مجرد استفسارات أو طلب مزيد الإيضاحات. السؤال ربما اللي يتبادر للذهن ونحن في هذه المرحلة، كيف يمكن الرفع من الإنتاجية وتطويرها؟ هي طبعا هل هي مسؤولية الحكومة أو العاملين في مختلف القطاعات؟ كذلك كيف يمكن الاستغلال الأمثل للطاقات المتجددة، ونحن الآن لربما في المستقبل إذا لم نعتمد هذه الطاقات فسنبقى لربما في إحراج في المستقبل. كذلك الحد من هجرة الأدمغة، وهي طبعا مسؤولية نعتبرها دقيقة ومهمة الآن، لأن هناك الآلاف من الطاقات التي تغادر البلاد، والحال أنه يمكن معالجة هذا الموضوع بإيجاد الحلول السريعة وذات المدى البعيد. شكرا.
Take one more question. We still have time for more.
السلام عليكم. باش نحكي بالتونسي.
تفضلي.
أنا عبير بن كيلاني، نعمل ماستر اون اوربانيزم وعامله بليزيور ديسبلين. حبيت نقول لك، حكيت على لي بوليتيسيان صاحب نحكي بقى من شباب الثورة نحب نغيروا ريت اللي تحكي فيه الكل. أنا بالحق حضرت برسك قداش من حضرت دي زيكسبير أبار لي بوليتيسيان عندهم العالم نتاعهم عايشين فيه، ميم لي زيكسبير تونيزيان في لي ديفيرون في التوجهات المختلفة الاقتصادية تحسهم قاعدين يدوروا في نفس الصندوق. يعني برسك خلينا نقول لقيت شكون حكى فيها بوضوح مسألة كما نقول الانرجي سولير ولا الطاقات متجددة والحياة الإيكولوجية. خاطر أنا كي نحضر في ديفيرون في كونفيرونس ناخذ من كل حاجة شوية، مي هكا واضحة راهي الكلمة تتقال ديريكتومون سي بور لا بروميير فوا. نحب نقول لك اليا دي جون في الحاجات هذوما الكل يخدموا فيها، مي اون ا بوكو دو ديفيكولتي. حكيت على حاجة بالعيون، اليا دوتر اكزومبل. فما باغ اكزومبل ان جون تونيزيان قريب باش يحرق روحه، هدد بيحرق روحه باش يعمل سو جون دو بروجي. دونك يافي دوتر جون دو ريفوليسيون اللي مشاو عملوا سيتين معاه باش نجح فيه. يعني اليا دي انيسياتيف مي ما فماش
فماش فيزيون
معناها كل واحد قاعد يعمل واحد دي جون قاعدين كل واحد يعمل في بلاصتو في كل شيء بما فيه في التكنولوجيا. عندنا مخترعين شبان في مجال التكنولوجيا المتجدده اللي هما مش لاقين حتى ارضيه باش ينجموا يطوروا فيها للمشاريع نتاعهم. دونك انت كسبيسياليست ما نعرفش، انا قاعده كل مره الموضوع هذا ديما يدور في مخي، اسكو الاقتصاد الاجتماعي والتضامني يعاون باش تزيد تلم الطاقات هذه ونقدموا في اون افونس خطوه بخطوه. خاطر توا فيك بصراحه توا فيك الانتخابات الجديده فما ليا ليسبوار، حاله الوعي موجوده، ليا ليسبوار كون فا افونسي. راهي هذه بالحق الحاله ايجابيه، فنحاول نستغلوا الوضع الايجابي هذايا بور افونسي بتيت ا بتيت. دونك كومون فير لو سيستيم هذا كل فاش نربطوا في بعضه، موجود في كل بلاصه في تونس، موجودين بارتو الافكار هذه عند شباب، لكن ماهوش بك الوعي اللي لازمها الكل تتلم. دونك انت كسبيسياليست كيفاش ترى الامر هذا؟ شكرا.
Maybe I can start with these questions because I'll start forgetting. So I'll start with in reverse order, and maybe I should translate some of the questions. So the question is, some people don't have their headphones. I can go ahead and translate, yeah. So the question was, in Tunisia, there's a lot of young people who are engaged in a lot of these sustainable energy and agriculture and housing policies across the country, but it's literally individuals who are so disconnected from the broader vision and the presentation that I interconnected all of these pieces with international trade and so on. And that's exactly why I did this presentation, is to provide a comprehensive vision. And my answer earlier about hope and despair is really exactly your point, which is if we don't have a vision at the national level with political leadership that believes in the alternatives and provides a framework, a legal framework, a political framework, a financial framework to capitalize on the energy of young people, on the innovation, on the passion that they have for these, local technologies. If we don't have a vision from the Ministry of Education that sees the importance of research and development within the university system to feed into these technologies, then we're going to have a bunch of young people trying their best in different parts of the country on a very small scale, and then getting discouraged and not succeeding on the scale that we want to see them succeed. So that's why it's important for us to engage at the highest level with political leadership to provide this alternative vision and capitalize on the passion and ingenuity of young people who are the experts in this area. And so that's my hope, right? And if we don't have that political vision, I'm afraid that it's going to be small NGOs and individuals doing this on a very small scale, which is important, but it's not going to be transformative on the scale with the potential that I'm describing here. So I hope that there is plenty of people who finally start connecting the dots and realizing that this is a way out. Then I can maybe answer the second question in relation to this. The question was about brain drain and what can be done immediately because Tunisia is losing more people at an accelerating rate in recent years. The question was also about the process of industrialization and high productivity and high value-added content. How do we get there? And I alluded a little bit to this when I talked about developing countries following import substitution industrialization versus, say, Japan or Korea or Singapore. So the political system is very important for that, because you had a period of protectionism. So you can nurture your infant industry without external competition. But in the case of Tunisia, it was essentially giving monopoly licenses to individuals as political rewards for supporting particular, government, leadership. At the time it was Bourguiba. And it was done under protectionism, so there was no pressure from the government or requirement to say, within the next 10 years, you have to improve efficiency, you have to improve quality, you have to improve customer service, you have to improve competitiveness, so that in 10 or 15 years, when we open to international trade, you're able to compete with German technology or British technology or American technology. There is none of that. As a matter of fact, it was more subsidies, more protectionism, with no commitment to improving productivity or innovation or any of that. Whereas in the case of Korea or Singapore, it was done under a dictatorship. It wasn't a democratic process. It was a very brutal system, but it was always provisional, conditional protectionism. So you're protected for a period of 10 years, but you have to meet a certain target of improving productivity, improving competitiveness, because the goal was, after 10 years or 15 years or whatever, you're going to open to the international system, and at that point you're going to lose your protection, and you have to stand on your own and compete with Japanese technology and German technology and British technology, which means if you can't stand on your own and compete, you're doing a national disservice to all the subsidies and all the protection that you are receiving. So this was a political failure of giving protectionism and feeding corruption and creating a business elite class that accumulated a massive amount of wealth under protection. And when we opened to the global system, that elite lost their businesses and invested in real estate, or they didn't lose as a class, but the economy and society lost in terms of jobs and in terms of competitiveness. So today, it's very hard to go back to protectionism, and I'm not advocating protectionism. That's why I'm advocating not closing the economy and asking for protectionist policies. This will require massive global transformation. I don't think it's doable. I don't think it's effective. Instead, I'm trying to think of strategies to exit from under the power structures and create more decentralized, localized, native technologies and native industries that, number one, allow you to create a new ecosystem that's decentralized. Number two, allows you to exit the power structure of the price setters of the corrupt, corporate elite within the economy. So you're not asking for their permission to change their behavior. You're just leaving them as is and creating your own structure. And I think that's more strategic, that's more effective than begging the power elite and the corrupt officials to please redistribute and please provide a better system for us. So it's a strategic choice, and I think we've tried everything else with the existing structure and it's not going to work. So once you create a new ecosystem that provides decent employment and dignified quality of life, and once young, highly educated people see the potential in their own local economy, you'll see less of the brain drain that we currently see. So when we're talking about high-tech aquaponics, it's not going to be local farmers. It's going to be engineers and biologists and people with degrees in chemistry investing in local communities and producing high value-added content and finding a passion and connecting with local economic benefits. Most people, myself included, if I had decent employment opportunities here, why would I leave my parents? Why would I leave my friends? Why would I leave everything to go abroad? Right? Most people want to be in their country, want to be in their neighborhood, want to be close to their food and culture. I'm not saying everybody should stay or people should have the choices, but we're creating a situation where people have no choice, no opportunity for livelihood other than the exit and the brain drain. And it's made worse when the government itself is encouraging highly skilled people to leave the country. When I was in Tunisia at the time, during the Ben Ali regime, they created, this is the time of the youth unemployment crisis. The government, official government policy listed 42 strategies to create jobs for youth. 42, I still remember. I think it was number 41 on the list. This is official Tunisian government policy, is assist university graduates to find employment abroad. Official government policy for the government, Tunisian government, that spent 25% of its budget for the last 50 years prior to that on education and health to produce young people with university degrees, and then as an employment policy is to find employment for them abroad as a gift to another country. Here is a brand new college graduate, ready to contribute to your economy. That's a failure on so many levels, right? Because we don't have a different vision to create opportunities locally. The only vision we have is how do we import more, how do we dig more natural resources, how do we send people away so that we reduce unemployment, so that they send a little bit of dollars or euros to the central bank. So that's really the trap that we're stuck into. And it's not going to go away unless we think of a different local economic structure. And that's what I try to provide today. And I'm sorry I forget the question. If you can repeat briefly the first question. In terms of the size of the population?
What's your take on African population? Do you think it's an elephant that will be addressed, or do you think
So food security in relation to growing population. Population growth and economic growth and increases in the levels of education and improvement in commitment to women's rights are interrelated. So if we reduce population growth just as a policy, as a strategy, in and of itself is not going to solve the other problems. So it's kind of having to work on all of these elements at the same time, as opposed to just focusing on population growth or just focusing on women's health or just focusing on women's rights. All of these things are equally important, but without the comprehensive vision of food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, commitment to a different kind of economic development, in addition to the democratic process, women's rights process, population control per se is better achieved, or population management is better achieved through more equitable opportunities in the labor market, through more equitable opportunities for women in the educational system. That's, you set population management on autopilot when you have all of those opportunities. So it's important to have a comprehensive vision.
Fadhel Kaboub, I'm an economic researcher in University of Sfax. I've been working on monetary policy in Tunisia, and for the last year I've been working on the influence of interest rate, exchange rate on the inflation, and how the monetary policy has an influence on the macroeconomic indicators. So I've reached a dead end. Everything the central bank or the monetary authorities in Tunisia do has no impact on the inflation rate. So it's, for example, they raise the interest rate for, I don't know, in January 2019, yeah. But it has completely no impact on the inflation rate. So in your opinion, what do you think the monetary authorities in Tunisia should do to control or maintain the inflation rate at a stable basis for now? Not for the long run, but in the short run. Thank you.
We'll take other questions.
شكرا. رضا شكنديلي أستاذ الاقتصاد بالجامعة التونسية. عايشك. انطلقتم من أن السيادة الوطنية، السيادة النقدية هي تعكس صحة اقتصادية جيدة. ولكن في تونس نعيش في بداية هذه السنة أزمة اقتصادية حادة، تراجع كبير على مستوى النمو الاقتصادي، تفاقم العجز التجاري وعديد المؤشرات السيئة. ولكننا نلاحظ أن هناك تحسن على مستوى سعر الصرف. بماذا تفسرون هذا؟
One more question?
بونجور، عالسلامة الناس الكل. أنا جميلة كسيكسي عضو مجلس النواب. Je vous remercie, Monsieur Fadhel, d'avoir pointé le doigt sur un problème très sérieux. Et vous avez vraiment bien avancé le paradoxe africain, qui a toutes les potentialités pour être développé, mais malheureusement, la situation du continent, nous le connaissons tous. Et la Tunisie ne fait pas l'exception. Nous avons tout pour être mieux, mais malheureusement, la situation du pays, comme l'a dit M. Shkondeli actuellement, et vraiment, nous sommes dans une situation lamentable. Nous avons bien sûr souffert des choix politiques, des choix de modèle économique et de politique monétaire depuis 1950, comme vous l'avez dit. Et jusqu'à présent, on cumule les problèmes décennie après décennie. Jusqu'à présent, nous n'avons pas vraiment une vision claire pour dépasser cette crise qui a duré. Ma question, c'est quand on propose une nouvelle vision, on doit bien sûr mettre en avant dans notre analyse des contraintes qui sont énormes. Il y a les partenaires sociaux, il y a l'opinion publique, il y a les médias, il y a les systèmes corrompus ou la corruption qui, à mon avis, a un pouvoir invisible, mais qui impacte l'économie tunisienne et impacte la vie des citoyens d'une manière très nuisible. Tout ça, on doit les prendre en considération. Êtes-vous d'accord qu'il nous faut un projet culturel qui doit s'associer à cette nouvelle vision que vous avez proposée? Tous les politiciens sont conscients que nous devrons avoir un changement radical et que nous devrons avoir un changement structurel de tout notre modèle économique et notre politique monétaire. À mon avis, le projet culturel qui devrait accompagner doit se reposer sur la participation citoyenne, bien sûr, sur l'engagement sociétal pour éradiquer la corruption. Et on doit avoir à l'esprit également, on doit travailler beaucoup plus et on doit surtout sacrifier. Tout ça, c'est pas facile. Nous sommes face à une migration vers un autre modèle, mais avec beaucoup de sacrifices que nous devons faire, nous tous, citoyens et partis politiques, et les agrégats économiques et tout le monde. Tout ça, c'est pas facile. Ça va bien sûr ça va nous coûter énormément. Et ces sacrifices doivent se faire pour les générations futures qui doivent vivre une situation plus confortable. Je suis de votre avis qu'on doit exploiter ou bien mettre notre patrimoine culturel à la disposition de notre développement économique. Vous, en tant qu'expert en économie et en expert en politique monétaire, comment peut-on faire cette adéquation entre tout ce qui est aspect culturel et aspect changement économique et financier dans les pays? Merci.
I can start answering the questions also in reverse order. So the question, I don't know if everybody has translation, but the question is about emphasizing the importance of corruption in the process and the transition to this new vision, but also emphasizing the idea that this is not just a change in political vision, but it requires a new cultural adaptation across civil society and the political system and all participants in this process. And I agree, but we're not going to have a shift in the cultural orientation unless we have some leadership that provides this alternative vision. Right? I can speak about this for the next 10 months here in Tunis, and I'm not going to create a cultural revolution or a new political direction. But it takes, one member of parliament, maybe, or the president or a prime minister setting up an agenda and saying, let's have a national conversation about this. We're not saying let's start it tomorrow. Let's at least have a national conversation and bring all the young people and the experts and people who are so desperate for a different solution, for a different alternative. And many people, as was mentioned earlier, are already working on small bits and pieces of an alternative, but they don't have the support, they don't have the clout and the leverage of the Ministry of Agriculture. They don't have the clout or leverage of the Ministry of Education, right? So we can start with all of these small things, but it's not going to lead anywhere unless you have a national vision for this. And this relates to your question about your question about the central bank and inflation. Sometimes when I do this presentation, I use a different title and I say, this is why central bankers need to learn about agriculture. This is why central bankers need to learn about education. This is why central bankers need to learn about renewable energy, because that's a more effective way to target inflation. The metaphor that sometimes we use is when you're driving the car and you have your child sitting in the back seat playing with a toy, and they think that they're driving the car, but you're actually in the driver's seat. That's what central bankers do. They're sitting in the child seat in the back, and they think they're driving the economy, when what's driving the economy are price setters in the system. What's driving the inflation is food imports and energy imports, and central bankers are changing interest rates and thinking that they did something. They didn't do anything. 10 years after the global financial crisis, the mainstream of the economics profession, all major central banks have recognized that. And now even Mario Draghi, who's not my friend, by the way, Mario Draghi last month came out and said, we tried everything, with the baby seat in the back. We tried everything, and we failed. All major central banks, the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve Bank, for a decade, Bank of Japan for 3 decades, trying to target inflation to escape the deflationary situation that they face. They tried every trick in the economics textbook, the mainstream economics textbook, to manage inflation, and they failed. They wanted to create inflation, and they failed. And Mario Draghi last month said, we tried everything, we failed. And he said, completely unprompted, he wasn't asked by a journalist, what do you think about MMT? He came out completely and said, it's time for governments to consider some of the ideas from MMT, which is what I'm describing today. So central bankers need to realize that the only thing they can target effectively is not inflation, but short-term interest rates. And how is it targeting short-term interest rate? How is it going to take care of food imports or energy imports or inflation coming from corruption and from market power or from trafficking across borders? It doesn't do anything. And I think now, after 10 years of the global financial crisis trying to deal with the concept of inflation targeting, central bankers are realizing that it's not in their hands. The power is mostly in the hands of parliaments and congresses across the world with fiscal policy and regulation and taxation. But again, regulation and taxation not for the purpose of funding government programs, but regulation and taxation to weaken, oligarchy and price setters and corruption. That's just as important for inflation targeting as setting interest rate or setting exchange rates. So I think this is a paradigm shift, not just for politics, but this is a paradigm shift within the economics profession, that we're realizing the mainstream dominant theories about inflation and interest rates and exchange rate are not functioning. And that's why MMT is emerging as an alternative for this paradigm shift, to give us a new lens to understand the structures and to transition into solutions that are more practical. And finally, I want to close by saying, I keep saying structural, and in your comments you said radical solutions. I keep saying structural because a lot of people, when they hear radical, they freak out. But radical is what I'm looking for, because radical means going to the roots. That's the meaning of the word. And I want radical solutions to change the roots of the problem. anything that's not radical is superficial. And superficial doesn't change anything. And everything we're trying is superficial. Band-aid solutions, trying to manipulate the exchange rate, trying to manipulate interest rates, and keeping the same structures. So what central banks are doing when they target inflation and say, this is the level of inflation that we're willing to tolerate, implicitly they're saying, this is the level of unemployment and poverty and exclusion that we need in order to target the exchange rate, in order to stabilize inflation. That's implicitly what they're saying. Sometimes they say it explicitly in meetings and joke about it, and then the information leaks, but that's exactly what they're doing. They're throwing people under the bus in order to achieve a stable level of inflation, a stable level of interest rate. And who benefits from stable levels of inflation, stable levels of interest rates? It's the power elite. I mean, we see this happening in Lebanon as we speak, with, you know, the entire economy held hostage so that bankers can have a guaranteed rate of return, guaranteed by the government. So we're sacrificing people's livelihood, people's dignity, people's quality of life to serve the interest, pun intended here, the interest of the elite.
Thank you, Fadhel. Just to be fair and to not go
yes, I know we went over time.
I will only give the possibility for only 2 final questions, and please answer very rapidly because there is a coffee break.
Okay.
And I will ask everyone to reduce our time of coffee break. It was supposed to be half an hour, so please 10 minutes and we come back because there is a second panel this morning, yes. And then we still can continue after lunch. Riyad Tayoub from South Africa, Seatini, please. C'était laquelle?
The exchange rate. I'll answer it. Yes. Sorry. I'm a little bit passionate about this inflation thing, if you notice. Yeah.
Ah, sorry. Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
But I'll start with your question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm Saif Batri.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for your talk and for your answers. First, my question will be toward forward. What about reinventing currencies to treat those issues about ecology, economics issues, and those currency reinvented in purpose to incentivize and change like the consumers and producers' behavior?
Thank you.
When you say reinvent currencies, you're thinking crypto, digital?
Maybe crypto, maybe like just only local currency, ecological currency.
Local currency, yeah, okay, thanks.
Thanks for a fabulous presentation, and also I think 90% I'm with you. I just want to ask the elephant in the room
What's
question.
the other 10%?
Yeah, it comes. Eh? Why should we go for modern monetary theory that aptly describes a rich country financial system, whereas center and periphery, north, south, third world, right? Or basically the wretched of the earth, right? Economics is perfectly adequate. So could you just extemporize on that?
Sure.
I mean, I've read your stuff, but I'd just like
Thank
it
you.
explicit.
Yeah. So I'll start. I'm sorry for skipping the question from the professor about the question was, Tunisia's exchange rate improved a little bit lately. What is the explanation? I don't know the exact explanation, but I know it has to do with the level of central bank intervention, with foreign currency reserves being a little bit more available, either because of improvement in the trade balance temporarily or more assistance from foreign lenders. So I'll have to check to give you a definitive answer. But it's not a structural change. My reading of it is it's a temporary event, and it's not going to last structurally. A quick answer, because of the coffee break, on local currencies. Yes, local currencies can be helpful in decentralizing economic activity, but they're limited in terms of their scope and their macroeconomic impact. I'm not against local currencies. I'm in favor of local currencies, but they don't reach the level that I'm describing here. In terms of digital and crypto, I think we have a couple of panels that I think those questions will be addressed there. My short answer is that anything that doesn't give us the full monetary sovereignty that I'm describing here. It's just an attempt at, tweaking around the system, but not structural enough. With more colleagues who will discuss this question, I think, tomorrow in one of the panels. And then your 10% disagreement on MMT, I would push back against the idea that MMT is just for, countries like the US. I mean, this is exactly the purpose of my presentation, is to say, yes, this is where the US is, and this is how countries that have full monetary sovereignty can operate. But we're talking about us developing countries without the full monetary sovereignty that I described. And I'm saying these are structural solutions that will get us into a position to be equally sovereign in terms of monetary sovereignty, which means independent and autonomous in setting the national priorities. So when you have full monetary sovereignty, just to give you an example, you have full monetary sovereignty like the US, you can decide, well, we can afford to spend more on military, so let's invade Canada. Doesn't mean that we should do it. This is where a democratic process comes in, right? In a democracy, you set the priorities straight, and if you have truly participatory democracy, the national priorities serve the majority of the people. But you can have full monetary sovereignty and decide we're going to use the power of the state to serve a small elite and throw everybody else under the bus. That has nothing to do with the concept of monetary sovereignty in the MMT observation. If anything, the MMT observation is empowering to the rest of us to say, the state has this capacity, and we live in a democratic, or aspire to live in a democratic society, so we have to recognize this power and use it in a democratic way to serve the working class and the middle class as opposed to the elite. So I think MMT is even more important for developing countries to recognize this, even though we don't have the full monetary sovereignty, but recognizing the potential, the democratic and the power redistribution potential is much more vibrant within the MMT framework than any of the mainstream theories that assume power away. So I'm 100% on that direction. And if you're not convinced, because we have to take a coffee break, I'll spend the next 3 days with you and we'll talk some more.
Il est toujours là
Thank you.
durant les 3 prochaines journées. Je vous invite à prendre une pause café et on se retrouve à midi, s'il vous plaît, pour le prochain panel.